This presentation is brought to you by the SDG Decision Education Center.
I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Right Decisions Right Now, Observations from 30 Years of Decision Education. My name is Hannah Winter, and I am the Program Director for the Wharton Executive Education and SDG Strategic Decision and Risk Management Certificate Program. Today's session is presented by the SDG Decision Education Center in collaboration with the Oresti Institute of Executive Education at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, SDG's university partner in the Strategic Decision and Risk Management Certificate Program. The courses and certificate blend Wharton's academic and research expertise with the 35 years of real-world management consulting experience of Strategic Decisions Group. These concepts and skills empower participants to make high-quality decisions and embrace risk and uncertainty for competitive advantage. I'm delighted to be joined today by Bruce Judd. Dr. Judd has over 45 years of experience as a consultant and educator in strategic decision-making. As an educator, he founded and directs SDG's Executive Education Program, which helps clients to transform the way they make strategic decisions. He has taught in MBA programs for roughly 20 years, including 14 at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. As a consultant, his specialty is making complex corporate decisions in many industries, including energy and high tech. He's also completed several successful public sector risk-benefit projects in arms control, reactor safety, and nuclear safeguards. And now let me turn it over to Bruce.
Thanks, Hannah. Our subtitle today is Observations from 30 Years of Decision Education, and I want to be the first to acknowledge that in our audience today, there are many old friends, longtime associates, who have been business partners of mine, educators of decision practitioners, teachers of decision analysis and MBA programs, and consultants who share the view that we should both advise and educate our clients. You and I have probably made many similar observations, or perhaps some of them contrary. I invite you to send them in, and I'll try to save time to discuss your observations. Now, our title is Right Decisions Right Now. Let me change that for just a moment to Wrong Decisions Right Now. So over the 3 decades that SDG's had its education practice, I've repeatedly experienced decision makers who have a compulsion to make quick decisions. So here's 3 examples. Here's an Australian oil and gas company. The head of projects walks in and says, "This is a schedule-driven project. We need to move fast." What that means is you're intentionally overlooking alternatives that might lead to first oil a little bit later, but might be better for the organization. Here's another one. This is a medical products company with a gap in the product line. They decide to acquire a company that had products to fill that gap. But Salesforce wouldn't sell their products, and nobody had asked the Salesforce their view on this acquisition. So unfortunately, they had to sell the company they had just acquired. Here's a third one that happened earlier this year at a national oil company. We had a project team who had spent the previous week before we arrived working on framing the decision problem. And when we got into discussions with them after our arrival, we started framing the decisions. They said, hey, we did this all last week. Well, when we asked, the members of that team really couldn't remember what they'd agreed to, or if they did, what they remembered is they were opposed. So the decision makers often think they know the right decision and they've got a bias for action. But are they asking or being asked the right questions up in front? Here's another one that is at the other end of the spectrum. No decisions now, maybe later. So I've also seen, and I'm sure many of you have, situations where the decision gets delayed. Here's a somewhat extreme example of that. Early in my career, I worked on the retirement of a nuclear power plant. The head of that organization said, we need to make a decision, and I know that we've looked at it 4 times before, but this time we really need to decide. And what had happened is they had put many single point estimates into their analysis of the decision, And each time they analyzed it again, they put in different single point estimates, and they kept coming to different conclusions. But this time we really needed to decide. And what we did was a full probabilistic analysis. And at the end of that, the best decision was clear. Here's one other example. I know you've seen this, so I won't spend time on it. So before we make this move, I need to see better data. Let's take our first poll, and the question is, what style of decision-making prevails in your organization? Choose the one that is the best fit. Questions, answers, possible answers are: we shoot from the hip. Second one, we move too fast and often miss our targets, or we move too slow and we lose opportunities and miss our targets. We make sure to get the big ones right. Hopefully nothing of you are saying that's the way it works in our company. So we get it right first and then we go fast, or some other style. Okay, so what we see here is that many are moving slowly. In fact, that's the modal response here, and still missing our targets. It would be interesting to explore in greater detail what is the delay. I'm going to assume, just based on my experience, that this is often either waiting for better data or waiting for the team to really get on board and start making this decision. So let's close that poll and we'll go on to ask the question, why all this dysfunctional decision behavior? Well, my bottom line, actually here it's the top line, is that executives are impatient. And by the way, there's a quote at the bottom of this slide that I'm not going to take time to read. You might want to look ahead to it. So executives are impatient. They think they know the best way forward, and they really don't like time wasting time trying to get alignment. Or they trust their gut more than they trust your numbers, or they feel comfortable only when they have the data. And we have massive data available to us these days. Big data, you hear that phrase a lot. But unfortunately, even after all those years, there are still no data about the future. Data is about the past. So oftentimes it just doesn't satisfy the decision makers. But I'll come back to what I said first, and that is they're impatient. And we'll give you some examples of these. Now, the keys to making the right decisions right now, one of them is something that you've seen from us before. It's this chain, and it is a relatively simple way to judge the quality of the decision at the time you make the decision. Do we have the right frame? What about our alternatives, the choices we have? Do we have quality there? Do we have quality in our information, both what we know and what we don't know? And then have we been clear about what we're trying to achieve in this situation? In other words, what are our values? We need some sound reasoning to put together what choices we have, what information we have, and what do we want to achieve. And the ultimate goal is to get commitment from the decision makers. If there's no commitment, there won't be any action. And if there's no action, there won't be any decisions. So this all sounds like common sense. The only problem is that these days, even after all these years, common sense is still not all that common. Maybe you can see me. I'm actually smiling. It was Ron Howard who many years ago taught me that quip. Let's take the first one of these, which is frame. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to give you a couple examples of what I've seen over the years. So framing is designed to answer common questions that need to be asked up front, but unfortunately sometimes they're not. Common questions such as, what decision are we actually considering? What's the right scope for this decision? Who should be involved? In our backyard, we've got a lot of tech companies, and we're surprised over and over again when we go into some of those companies that they're not really sure who's the decision maker, who's got a voice, who's got visibility, who's got a vote, and who's got a veto. We call those the 4 V's, obviously. If we can answer those questions up front, it makes the decision process go faster. And here's one more. I did a lot of work on capacity expansion early in my career, and Hannah Winter, whom you met up in front, and I worked on a project together for a big company that had contacted us, It said, we've got a manufacturing plant. We simply can't keep up with demand. We need more capacity. So Hannah asked them early in the project, so what do you make in this plant? What do you sell it for? And what's your unit manufacturing cost? And they said, well, Hannah, we make a lot of stuff in this plant. It would be pretty hard to get a complete list for you. And Hannah, if you know Hannah, she knows she's persistent. And she said, I'd like to have that list. And it took them 2 or 3 weeks, but eventually they came back with the answer to her question, how much do you make or how much profit on each of the items? And the answer was, well, we actually lose money on about a third of our products, but you know, they're really big sellers. So what's happening here? Well, these framing questions need to be asked and answered up front. Unfortunately, often they're not. And if you don't do that, you'll often find yourselves on the wrong path. In this case, it would have been adding capacity so the company could lose even more money even faster. Here's another one, information. So how does your organization do with providing relevant and reliable information to your decision makers, especially on the most long-term, high-consequence decisions? Here's another poll for you about information for those long-term strategic decision makers. What are they actually demanding of you so that they can make a decision? Is it qualitative support? Give me some qualitative answers like, this is going to be a real blockbuster for us. Is it only historical data that might be relevant for the decision? Are they single point forecasts out into the future? Are they ranges on key uncertain variables? And here's one that's even a little more sophisticated than the last one. Are they well described quantitative future scenarios of how the environment might look 3-5 years out into the future? So here's what you said. The modal response is 29%. We provide ranges on key uncertain variables, and I said that was the modal response. Actually, the last one was well-described quantitative future scenarios. So we've got over 50% doing what we think is the right approach to this. And all I can do is congratulate you, but this may be a self-selected sample, right? The kind of people paying attention here are often decision analysts in their own right. Okay, so let's go on. Let's talk a little bit more about information. And an important question is, how do you quantify the quality of our information? Here's what's called a calibration curve. And what it does is plot on the horizontal axis probabilities that were assessed on future events. And on the vertical axis, it plots the success rate. And if you're on the 45-degree line, you're what we call perfectly calibrated. Let me give you a little bit more information on that. Here's some good news. Here are data from 730 probability assessments made by an extensively trained subject matter experts. I said an expert, I meant multiple experts at Eli Lilly and Company, tracked over 13 years, and I've actually seen 15 years worth of data. Now, the one point that I'm showing here is there were 164 out of 730, 164 assessments, somewhere between 75 and 85%. That's been plotted here at the 80% level. Out of the 164, 134 of them, which turns out to be 82%, actually happened. Is that a good track record? I think so. Here are the other assessments at other probabilities, going all the way down to something that was extremely low probability or all the way up to something extremely high probability. And notice that for the probabilities that were assessed, and by the way, the number of assessments is what's in the middle of the circle there, the assessed probabilities and the actual success rate are very close. In other words, when the subject matter experts here say something will succeed with some probability, they're right. Thanks to Dr. Jay Anderson providing these data from Eli Lilly and Company. He has retired from there, but he established quite a track record, an impressive record over the years. So we've discussed only two of the elements of a high-quality decision. There are four more, and we won't go into detail about those. But it's useful to think that in many situations where we have highly complex and long-term decisions, you need an efficient and effective process to make those decisions, where you get the alternatives, the information, the values, etc. Here is a process that is both efficient and effective that we've been using since the early 70s. It looks something like this, and I'm not going to describe it in any detail, but there's always a decision maker or set of decision makers. We'll call that the decision board. And there's a project team that works through a process and has periodic interactions with the decision maker to make sure they're on the right track. They've got the right frame. They've got good alternatives. And then as they evaluate those alternatives, that leads to a situation where the decision can be made. And if it's a complex decision, we may need to look at an implementation plan and approve that. Now, the point of all this is to get insight and clarity among decision makers, which can lead to both alignment and commitment, which are, of course, essential for better strategic decisions. Now, let me just tell you what the clients of ours who have adopted this report. Number one, the strategies, whether they be business strategies or new product strategies, are significantly more valuable. One year, we took all of the projects that SDG did, all of them, and asked what decision was going to be made initially before you did your work, and then after you did your work, what decision was actually implemented, and what's the difference in value potential for those two. Surprisingly, the ratio of what the value potential created by doing the project was relative to what the cost of the project was, both in consulting fees and in time for people within the company, it was a ratio of 3,000, I'll repeat that number, 3,000 to 1, all the projects we did over a 2-year period. So in other words, the cost of doing the project was in the noise relative to the value that was created. Here's another example. Our decision makers understand better the risks that they're facing. They've explored those risks and adopted cost-effective risk mitigation measures. These are all things that clients report back to us. The decision process is more efficient because they can reward, did I say reward? I meant avoid rework. And then finally, decision makers who were once skeptical and impatient. I've got 2 examples of people that I know who were CEOs of companies, one's biotech, one's traditional pharma company, both initially skeptical and impatient, but once they've been trained and experienced the decision process, they became champions. So one last poll for you. For your organization's biggest decisions, what is it that decision makers demand? Number one, they rarely demand any of this. Number two, they demand dialogue on frame and alternatives at the front end. We've seen organizations that do that, but when it comes to doing quantitative analysis, no, they don't do that. How about they do the evaluation, but of one alternative only, and it's analysis without uncertainty. It's the single point estimates of the inputs to an evaluation of that one alternative, or evaluation of a few alternatives without uncertainty, or decision analysis of a whole set of alternatives, which of course is the goal. Again, the modal response is we've evaluated a few alternatives without the uncertainty. And the problem, well, let's say the good news of that is in many, many situations it's adequate. But once you have high consequences in the future and high uncertainty, if you don't put the uncertainty into the analysis and look at multiple alternatives, you're not getting to the best decision.
All right, thank you, Bruce. We've been answering some questions as they've come in, but I thought a few that came up that would best be answered by Bruce here live. So Bruce, let me go to the first question. Could you please give us some tips for good decision-making under time pressure? For example, when to decide in the face of uncertainty and when to wait?
Sure. I should mention Burke Robinson, who is a colleague of ours who actually did his PhD dissertation on time pressure and decision making when you've got to take quick action. But let's say you're in a situation that I described earlier where somebody's reluctant to make a decision now, they want better data. It's a relatively simple set of questions to ask, and they can be answered. You can determine whether you should wait or not. First question, what might I learn if I wait? Number two, for each of the things that I might learn, how will that change the decision that I'd make if I didn't wait? So I'm ready to make a decision now. I'm going down path A, let's call it. I might learn some things that would cause me to switch to path B. Not all the time, but many of them might. So now we get quantitative. What's the probability of learning something that changes my decision from what I would do now? And then also quantitative, how much better off am I when I learn that? Then if you take the probability weighted value of those improvements in the decision, many of you know that's the value of information, and you compare that to the cost of waiting, including both delay and cost of gathering the information, that tells you whether you should wait or not.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bruce. Next question. What are the key questions we need to ask and answer underpinning a high-quality process? So is there a way to quantify decision quality? Is there a checklist we should be using?
If you've been paying attention, we should have the answer to that back with the decision quality chain. Those are the questions you need to ask. And is there a quantitative way to describe that? We didn't mention that. I'll mention it right now. So how much information, for example, should you get? Well, we like to do kind of a cost-benefit analysis or point of diminishing returns. The right amount of information is that quantity of information such that if you spend more time gathering information, your costs of doing that are greater than the benefits of the information, and you can calculate the benefits of the information using the procedure that I just mentioned.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. How can a good decision maker objectively examine and evaluate the cognitive biases and the political pressures in an organization's culture early in the decision process and use this information to help assure decision quality? And there's one more follow-on question. How and at what point in the process of decision making should we identify and manage these biases?
Short answer is throughout the process. They occur everywhere from just choosing the decision makers in the process all the way through to biases in information biases and choosing the right approach. I think it was back in January, we did a webinar on the biases in decision making. Right? You can get a replay of that available. And it discusses what some of those biases are. In that webinar, we just had time for a few, the overconfidence and the confirmation bias. But these are things that plague us throughout, and we do mention these in the 2.5-day course that Hannah mentioned, Achieving Strategic Decision Quality, and we also go through things like that calibration for information that I mentioned earlier.
And then there's a couple of questions that have come in just now that I'd like to combine together, if you don't mind. So what's the most effective method you've used to convince decision makers that they need decision quality? Because I've encountered some familiarity. I see some familiarity, but much resistance. And then a related question from someone else: how do you get teammates to use the framework when it hasn't been directed from top down? So they're kind of related questions. One is, how do I convince my decision makers to do it? And then how do I get my teammates to do it when they haven't been told to do it?
Okay, so let me take the first one. Let me tell you how not to do it. Okay. What you don't want to do is walk into that decision maker and say, you've been making terrible decisions. That's a good way to get a pink slip. We know a guy where that happened years ago. And another thing is, I don't suggest saying we're going to help you make better decisions. I mean, they got to where they are simply because they've been making lots and lots of decisions. The question is, are we getting the most value we can out of the decisions, both for our enterprise or for the organization? And in that situation, some will say, I know what I want to do. In that case, you respond by saying, are you open to consideration of other alternatives? If they say no, politely say thank you and walk out of the office. But if they're open to it, then the next question Hannah asked is, so how do we convince the team to do it? If the decision maker is asking for it, it's easier. But if not, what you can do is something that a colleague that we've had for years named Carolyn Wang, who years ago attended a short course, the same one that Hannah mentioned is coming up. And she says, you know, I've been recognized as being a genius by my company. And she went from being a low-level product manager for IBM all the way to be head of sales and marketing for all of the Asia-Pacific region. We said, Caroline, that's an impressive accomplishment. How did you do that over 15 or 20 years? She said, that chain. I've asked those questions that are in that chain, and my colleagues think I'm a genius, and whether it's a project team or whether it's decision makers, that's worked well for her.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Bruce. This concludes today's session. Thank you for participating, and you may all now disconnect.